The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small settlement nestled between rolling hills and the vast, unforgiving prairie of Wyoming Territory. The year was 1878, and the town had grown from a mere trading post to a burgeoning community with the promise of the railroad's arrival. Wooden storefronts lined the street, their weathered facades telling tales of harsh winters and scorching summers. Men in worn boots and sweat-stained hats moved with purpose, while women in modest dresses hurried about their errands, casting wary glances at the stranger who had ridden in at dawn. Morgan Blackwood dismounted his dappled gray stallion outside the town's only hotel, his movements deliberate and efficient, betraying years spent in the saddle. At 45, the lines etched into his sun-leathered face spoke of hardships endured and battles fought, both on the battlefield of the recent war and in the unspoken conflicts that had followed him west. His eyes, steel blue and watchful, surveyed the town from beneath the brim of his dust-covered hat, missing nothing as he took in the measure of Redemption Creek. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know what city you're watching from today. The locals took note of the newcomer. They always did in towns like this, where strangers were potential threats until proven otherwise. Morgan's worn cavalry coat, though faded and patched, hung on his tall frame with a soldier's bearing. The holstered Colt Peacemaker on his hip was well maintained, but showed the wear of a tool rather than an ornament. As he secured his horse to the hitching post, he noticed the black bunting still draped across the sheriff's office across the street, a somber reminder of recent tragedy. 3 weeks earlier, Sheriff Thomas McAllister had been found dead in the dry creek bed outside town, his body riddled with bullets from an ambush that had shocked the community. The town still whispered about it, theories spinning like tumbleweeds across the prairie, but no culprit had been found. Morgan had heard the tale at the last trading post he'd passed, how the upstanding lawman had left behind a young widow, how the town council had appointed a temporary deputy until elections could be held, and how the killer remained at large, possibly still walking among them. Inside the hotel, a bell tinkled as Morgan pushed through the door, the sudden dimness a relief from the glaring sun. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles perched on a bulbous nose, looked up from his ledger with practiced curiosity. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice carrying the nasal twang of someone who'd moved west from Pennsylvania or Ohio. Morgan nodded, placing a few coins on the counter without ceremony. "Passing through or staying a while?" the man continued, pushing the hotel register toward him. "Depends on what I find," Morgan replied, his voice deep and graveled from years of trail dust and whiskey. He signed his name with deliberate strokes, the kind of penmanship that suggested education before the hard years had claimed him. The proprietor, Willard Simmons, according to the small placard on his desk, studied the signature with unconcealed interest. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, not much to find in Redemption Creek these days, except trouble, maybe. Room 4, top of the stairs. Washrooms down the hall if you're inclined." Morgan took the offered key and climbed the creaking stairs, his saddlebags slung over one shoulder. The room was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a straight-backed chair near the window that overlooked the main street. He placed his Winchester rifle carefully against the wall before removing his hat and running a hand through his silver-streaked dark hair. The journey had been long, following whispers and half-truths across 3 territories, but instinct told him that Redemption Creek might hold the answers he sought. He poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed the trail dust from his face, studying his reflection in the splintered mirror. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw had faded to a silver line, a reminder of Shiloh and the life he'd left behind. After the war, he'd worn a badge himself for a time in Kansas, until circumstances had forced him to move on, to become the drifter he now was, a man with purpose but without roots. As dusk settled over the town, Morgan made his way to the saloon, a two-story establishment called the Lucky Strike. The piano player, a thin man with nimble fingers, tapped out a lively tune as cowboys, miners, and townsmen sought relief from their daily labors. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, the smell of whiskey, and the perfume of the few women who worked the floor. Morgan ordered a whiskey and found a table in the corner that afforded a view of both the entrance and the ornate bar, where a woman in a deep purple dress presided with unexpected authority. She was perhaps 35, with auburn hair piled elegantly atop her head. Her features striking rather than beautiful. The bartender deferred to her, and even the rowdiest patrons seemed to moderate their behavior under her watchful gaze. Morgan observed as she managed the flow of drinks with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for years. Yet something in her demeanor suggested it hadn't always been her occupation. It didn't take long for locals to approach, curiosity overcoming caution as the whiskey flowed. A gray-bearded miner named Jenkins introduced himself, eager to share the town's gossip with fresh ears. "Saw you looking at Miss Eleanor over there," he said, nodding toward the woman in purple. "That's Eleanor McAllister, sheriff's widow. Owned this place before she married Tom 3 years back. Running it again now, though folks whisper it ain't proper, her being in mourning and all." Morgan nodded, offering nothing in return, but Jenkins needed little encouragement. "Terrible business with the sheriff. Good man, Tom. Kept order without much fuss. Some say it was bandits from up north. Others think it might have been personal. The deputy? That's Bill Hargrove. He's been acting sheriff since, but between you and me, he couldn't track a bleeding sheep in fresh snow." The miner leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Town's changed since Tom died. Quiet-like. You understand? Like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next." Morgan's attention shifted to a table near the bar where 4 men played cards, tension evident in their rigid postures and clipped words. The dealer, a sharp-faced man in an expensive waistcoat, had the cold eyes of someone who calculated odds beyond the turn of a card. Beside him sat a younger man whose resemblance marked him as likely a brother or cousin. The remaining players were a burly blacksmith with massive forearms and a thin, nervous man whose fingers drummed incessantly on the table edge. "That's Randall Green dealing," Jenkins supplied without being asked. "Owns the Mercantile now, but rumor has it he's buying up claims and properties all through the county. His brother Zachary, there's got a mean streak wider than the Platte River. The fidgety ones are Banker, Peterson, and the big fella's Hank from the smithy." Morgan noted how Eleanor McAllister's gaze frequently returned to the card game, a subtle tightness around her mouth when she looked at Green. As the night deepened, Morgan nursed his whiskey, gathering the currents of the town like a man reading signs in the wilderness. He learned that the Railroad Survey had recently confirmed that Redemption Creek would be on the main line, news that had sent property values soaring. He heard about the disputed water rights north of town, where several small ranchers were fighting a losing battle against a consortium led by unknown investors. and he noted how conversations hushed when they turned to the late sheriff's final days, as if the town itself were reluctant to examine the circumstances too closely. It was near midnight when Eleanor McAllister approached his table, her shrewd eyes assessing him with undisguised interest. "Mr. Blackwood, isn't it?" she said, her voice cultured despite the frontier setting. "I make it a point to know who drinks in my establishment. What brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" There was a directness to her question that suggested she was a woman accustomed to getting answers. Morgan met her gaze steadily. "Just passing through, ma'am. Heard Redemption Creek was brewing. Might be opportunities for a man willing to work." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. Eleanor's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've had our share of men passing through lately. Some stay, some go. Some should have gone sooner." She glanced toward the card game, where Randall Green was collecting his winnings with a satisfied smirk. "If you're looking for work, Mr. Green there is always hiring men who can handle themselves. Though I'd advise considering what kind of employment you're willing to accept." Before Morgan could respond, a commotion erupted at the bar. A young cowboy, deep in his cups, had knocked over another man's drink and was now facing the consequences of his clumsiness. Eleanor excused herself to intervene, her authority immediately evident as the dispute settled under her stern words. Morgan left the saloon shortly after, the night air cool against his face as he walked the quiet street back to the hotel. Redemption Creek settled into uneasy slumber around him, but as he passed an alley between the general store and the land office, the sound of hushed voices caught his attention. He melted into the shadows, a skill honed through years of necessity. Two men stood in the darkness. One he recognized as Zachary Green from the card game, the other a thin figure who kept glancing nervously over his shoulder. "She knows something," Zachary was saying, his tone urgent. "My brother thinks we should wait, but I say we can't risk it. If she starts talking to the right people—" The other man, Peterson, the banker, shook his head frantically. "We can't just— It's too risky now, with all eyes on the town because of the railroad. Besides, she hasn't said anything in 3 weeks. Maybe she doesn't know as much as you think." Zachary grabbed the banker's lapel, pulling him close. "She was there that night. Tom must have told her something before he rode out. Why else would she be asking questions about the land deeds? Why else would she be going through his papers?" Peterson pulled away, straightening his rumpled coat with trembling hands. "This has gone too far already. I never signed on for what happened to the sheriff. I'm a businessman, not a—" Zachary cut him off with a harsh laugh. "You're in it now, same as the rest of us. Remember that." The men parted ways, with Peterson hurrying toward his home near the bank, and Zachary strolling with artificial casualness toward the saloon's side entrance. Morgan remained motionless until they were gone, processing what he'd heard. His instincts had been right. Beneath Redemption Creek's dusty facade, something dangerous was brewing, and the sheriff's widow stood at its center. Morning brought the town to life with the methodical rhythm of frontier existence. Morgan breakfasted at the small cafe adjacent to the hotel, where the aroma of strong coffee and frying bacon drew a cross-section of the community. The waitress, a friendly woman named Martha, seemed to know everyone's preferences without asking, sliding plates loaded with eggs and biscuits before customers as they took their usual seats. Morgan observed as Randall Green entered, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, and noted how conversations dimmed momentarily before resuming with forced normality. Green took a table near the window, acknowledging greetings with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to deference. The acting sheriff, Bill Hargrove, joined him shortly after, a man in his 30s, with a deputy star pinned somewhat crookedly to his vest. His gun belt looking newer than his weathered face suggested it should be. "Business looks good," Green remarked, loudly enough for the room to hear. "The survey team confirmed yesterday that the depot will be built on the north end of town. Property values there will triple by year's end." Hargrove nodded, accepting the cup of coffee Martha placed before him. "Good news for those who invested early," he agreed, with a glance around the room that suggested many present had not been so fortunate. Morgan finished his meal in thoughtful silence, paying particular attention to the dynamic between the two men. There was a subservience in Hargrove's manner that seemed at odds with his position of authority. As Green rose to leave, he paused by Morgan's table, his assessing gaze taking in the stranger's well-worn clothes and the calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder fighting. "New in town?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. "If you're looking for employment, stop by the Mercantile. I could use a man who looks capable of handling himself." After breakfast, Morgan set about establishing his presence in town with deliberate care. He arranged for stable space for his horse, purchased supplies at Green's Mercantile, noting the inflated prices and the subdued demeanor of the clerk, and visited the barber for a shave. The barber, an elderly man named Doc Wilson, who served as the town's informal physician as well, was a natural repository of information. "Town's changing," he commented as he stropped his razor. "Used to be folks looked out for each other more. Now it's all about who owns what piece of land, who's got the ear of the railroad men." As the sharp blade glided expertly across Morgan's jaw, Doc continued his observations. Take the sheriff's death. Time was, the whole town would have ridden out to find who did it. Instead, there was a quiet funeral, a few days of talk, and then silence. Like some folks were relieved, if you ask me. He lowered his voice despite the empty shop. "Eleanor McAllister's a strong woman. Tom was lucky to have her, though plenty thought she married beneath her, him being just a lawman and her coming from money back east. She's been asking questions, looking through land records, making some people nervous." By midday, Morgan had circled back to the sheriff's office, where he found Deputy Hargrove sorting through wanted posters with obvious disinterest. "Help you with something?" the acting sheriff asked, not bothering to stand from behind the desk that still bore the nameplate of Thomas McAllister. Morgan introduced himself as a former lawman looking for information about the territory. Thinking of settling, maybe. Heard Redemption Creek was a quiet town. Hargrove gestured to the chair opposite the desk, suddenly more animated at the prospect of conversation that might alleviate his boredom. "Quiet enough now," he agreed. "Had some trouble a few weeks back, as you might have heard, but that seems to be behind us." Morgan nodded sympathetically. "Must be difficult, stepping into a murdered man's boots. Any leads on who might have wanted the sheriff dead?" Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly, his initial openness receding. "Ambush. Most likely. Trail went cold fast. Could have been anyone passing through. Outlaws, deserters, renegade Indians. The territory's still wild beyond the town limits." Morgan steered the conversation to safer ground, discussing the challenges of maintaining order in frontier towns, sharing edited stories from his own days wearing a badge. Gradually, Hargrove relaxed again, revealing more about Redemption Creek's recent history. "Town's been here 20 years, but it was just a trading post until 5 years ago when silver was found in the hills north of here. That brought the first wave of growth. Then the railroad surveys started, and suddenly everyone wanted a piece of the future. He spoke with the enthusiasm of someone who had arrived just in time to catch the tide of prosperity. The McAllisters were fixtures by then, Eleanor running the lucky strike, Tom keeping the peace. They were a good match in some ways, though there were rumors. He trailed off, suddenly remembering his position. Anyway, the town council will hold elections for a permanent sheriff next month. I'm hoping to remove the acting from my title by then. As Morgan left the sheriff's office, he caught sight of Eleanor McAllister entering the land office across the street. She wore a simple black dress, her morning attire subdued but elegant, and carried a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Her purposeful stride and determined expression suggested a woman on a mission rather than one crushed by grief. Morgan crossed the street, timing his arrival at the land office door just as Eleanor was emerging, frustration evident in the tight set of her mouth. She nearly collided with him, looking up with a flash of irritation that quickly transformed into recognition. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged, composing herself. "Still exploring our little town?" Morgan tipped his hat, offering to carry the portfolio she clutched. After a moment's hesitation, she declined with a small shake of her head. "I'm perfectly capable, thank you, though I'm finding that capability isn't always enough in Redemption Creek, particularly for a widow seeking simple information." Morgan fell into step beside her as she moved down the boardwalk. "Land records?" he inquired, nodding toward the portfolio. Eleanor cast him a measured glance. "My husband kept meticulous notes about town affairs. I'm simply trying to understand them better." Her tone discouraged further questions, but Morgan pressed gently. "I couldn't help overhearing last night that you might be concerned about certain land transactions." Eleanor stopped abruptly, turning to face him with newfound wariness. "You seem awfully interested in local matters for a man just passing through, Mr. Blackwood. What's your real purpose in Redemption Creek?" The directness of her question demanded equal honesty. "I'm looking into a series of land grabs across the territory," Morgan admitted quietly. "Operations where local officials are bribed or threatened, property records altered, and those who resist often meet with unfortunate accidents. Your husband's death fits a pattern I've been tracking for 6 months." Eleanor's face paled slightly, her knuckles whitening around the portfolio. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "A former marshal," Morgan replied. "Not official anymore, but I have connections who are. I believe your husband may have discovered something that got him killed." For a long moment, Eleanor studied him, weighing his words against some internal measure. Then she glanced around the busy street, aware of the curious eyes that had noted their conversation. "Not here," she finally said. "Come to the back entrance of the Lucky Strike at sunset. We'll talk then." Without waiting for his agreement, she continued on her way, her back straight and her head held high. A woman walking through grief with dignity. Or perhaps, Morgan thought, a woman whose grief masked a deeper purpose of her own. The afternoon stretched long, as Morgan carefully observed the town's rhythms from various vantage points. He watched as Randall Green met with several well-dressed men who had arrived on the eastbound stage, railroad investors, judging by their conversation as they passed near Morgan's position outside the general store. He noted how Green's brother Zachary patrolled the town with 3 hard-faced men, ostensibly providing security, but clearly serving as a reminder of Green's influence. And he observed Eleanor McAllister as she moved between the bank, her saloon, and her modest home near the church, always carrying that same leather portfolio, always watched by someone in Green's employ. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Morgan returned to his hotel room to prepare for his meeting with Eleanor. He cleaned his peacemaker with practiced precision, checked that his boot knife was secure, and reviewed the documents hidden in a false bottom of his saddlebag, affidavits and land records from 3 other towns that had experienced similar patterns of corruption and violence. The sunset painted Redemption Creek in hues of gold and crimson as Morgan made his way through the back alleys toward the Lucky Strike. The saloon's real entrance was unobtrusive, a simple door that led to a small office separated from the main floor by a heavy curtain. Morgan knocked softly, alert to any sign of danger or surveillance. Eleanor opened the door herself, quickly ushering him inside before securing the lock. The office was neat and functional, a desk covered with ledgers, a small safe in one corner, and a wall of shelves holding bottles, presumably samples from the saloon's stock. Eleanor gestured to a chair as she took her seat behind the desk. "You're taking a risk coming here," she said without preamble. "Green has men watching me. He suspects I know something, but he's not certain what or how much." Morgan settled into the chair, noting that Eleanor had positioned herself with a clear view of both the door and the curtained entrance to the saloon. "What did your husband discover?" he asked directly. Eleanor opened a drawer and withdrew a small key, which she used to unlock the leather portfolio. "Tom was a thorough man," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion that flickered in her eyes. "He kept records of everything: land sales, water rights, mining claims. About a month ago, he noticed discrepancies in the county records. Properties that had been sold under suspicious circumstances, usually after the owners experienced a run of bad luck, fires, cattle dying mysteriously, threats." She spread several documents on the desk, hand-drawn maps annotated with names and dates, copies of land deeds with notations highlighting irregularities. He traced the purchases back to shell companies, all eventually leading to a single investor group based in Denver, the same group that's backing the railroad's expansion through the territory. Morgan examined the documents, recognizing the pattern he'd seen in other towns. "And Green is their local representative," he concluded. Eleanor nodded grimly. "Randall Green arrived 2 years ago, bought the Mercantile, started extending credit to struggling ranchers and miners. Then, when they couldn't pay, he'd offer to buy them out at a fraction of the true value." "Your husband confronted him?" Morgan asked, already suspecting the answer. Eleanor's face hardened. Tom believed in the law. He gathered evidence, sent telegrams to the territorial judge and the federal marshal's office. He was preparing to make arrests when she broke off, composing herself with visible effort. "3 weeks ago, he told me he found the final piece of evidence linking Green to the Denver syndicate. He rode out that evening to meet an informant who had documents proving the connection. They found his body the next morning, shot from ambush." Morgan studied her carefully. "And the evidence?" Eleanor shook her head. "Gone. Either Tom never received it, or it was taken from his body. But I've been piecing together what I can from his notes. The problem is, I can't prove anything without those missing documents. And meanwhile, Green's consortium is moving forward. They've acquired most of the land where the railroad depot will be built. Once that's complete, they'll control the town's economic future." A noise from the saloon, the sound of breaking glass and raised voices, caused Eleanor to tense. She rose and moved to the curtain, peering through a small gap. "Zachary Green," she murmured, "getting drunk and looking for trouble, as usual." She returned to the desk, her movements betraying tightly controlled anger. He's the real danger, impulsive, violent. Randall is calculating, but Zachary enjoys hurting people. I think he was the one who... She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Morgan nodded, adding this information to the pattern he was constructing. Your husband's informant. Any idea who it might have been? Eleanor hesitated. Tom was protective of his sources, but I suspect it might have been James Peterson, the banker. He and Tom had several private meetings in the weeks before the ambush, and Peterson has been acting strangely since. Nervous, drinking more than usual. I think he's involved somehow, maybe unwillingly. What's your plan? Morgan asked, respecting her enough to assume she had one. Eleanor's smile was grim. Stay alive long enough to expose them. The territorial judge is due next week for circuit court. If I can present enough evidence by then, there's a chance for justice. She studied Morgan intently. But now I need to know your intentions, Mr. Blackwood. Are you truly working with federal authorities? Or is there another reason you're tracking these land schemes? Morgan met her gaze steadily. Both, he admitted. I was a marshal in Kansas until 3 years ago. My brother owned a ranch near Lawrence. He refused to sell to a group similar to your Denver syndicate. They burned him out, killed his family. The local law was in their pocket, so no charges were filed. I've been following their operations ever since, building a case that even corrupt officials can't ignore. He didn't mention the 3 men he'd already found and dealt with personally, the enforcers who'd carried out the attack on his brother's ranch. That was a different kind of justice, one he kept separate from his work with the remaining honest lawmen in the territories. Eleanor absorbed this information, her expression softening slightly with understanding. Then we have common cause, she said finally. But we need to be careful. Green suspects I'm gathering evidence. That's why he's had me watched. And if he learns about your investigation, Morgan nodded, we'll need to move quickly. The judge arrives when? Eleanor consulted a small calendar on her desk. Tuesday next, 5 days from now. Morgan considered their options. We need Peterson. If he was your husband's informant, he might still have copies of the evidence, or at least know what it contained. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. Approaching him directly would be dangerous. Green watches him closely. Morgan rose, decision made. Then we create a diversion. Give Green something else to worry about while we get to Peterson. He outlined a plan, simple but potentially effective. Eleanor listened intently, suggesting modifications based on her knowledge of the town and its players. As they finalized the details, a new understanding formed between them, a partnership forged of shared purpose and mutual respect. As Morgan prepared to leave, Eleanor suddenly reached out, catching his arm. There's something else you should know, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The night before Tom was killed, he told me if anything happened to him, I should look beneath the floorboards under our bed. After the funeral, I found a small strongbox there, containing deeds to several properties around town, all purchased secretly in my name over the past year. Tom was building a case, but he was also protecting our future. He knew the risks he was taking. Her eyes met Morgan's, fierce with determination. I'm not just fighting for justice, Mr. Blackwood. I'm fighting for what's mine, what Tom and I built together. This town was supposed to be our fresh start. Morgan understood then that Eleanor McAllister was more than a widow seeking vengeance. She was a woman defending her territory with the same frontier spirit that had built towns like Redemption Creek across the West. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a reminder that winter wasn't far off, despite the lingering warmth of the afternoons. Morgan set the first part of their plan in motion, making a conspicuous visit to the telegraph office to send a message to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. The telegram was genuine, a coded update to his contact there, but its real purpose was to draw attention. Within an hour, one of Green's men entered the same office, presumably to inquire about Morgan's business. By noon, the word had spread through town that the stranger might be a federal lawman, creating exactly the stir Morgan had anticipated. He spent the afternoon openly taking notes as he walked the town, pausing to study property boundaries and engaging citizens in casual conversations about recent land sales. When Zachary Green confronted him outside the general store, demanding to know his business, Morgan simply smiled and suggested that the younger Green seemed unusually concerned for someone with nothing to hide. While Morgan provided this visible distraction, Eleanor implemented her part of the plan. As the owner of the Lucky Strike, she had legitimate reason to visit the bank regarding business loans and deposits. Peterson, as the bank manager, couldn't avoid meeting with her without raising suspicions. Eleanor had timed her visit carefully, arriving just before the bank's closing time when most other customers had concluded their business. Morgan, watching from across the street, saw her enter the bank and noted the nervous gesture with which Peterson ushered her into his private office. 20 minutes later, she emerged, her expression carefully neutral as she nodded politely to the teller locking the front door behind her. Only someone watching closely would have noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her shawl against the evening chill. Morgan followed at a discreet distance as Eleanor returned to the Lucky Strike, where they had arranged to meet after the saloon closed. It was well past midnight when Morgan slipped through the back door of the saloon once again. The main floor was empty, except for a tired-looking bartender cleaning glasses and Eleanor herself, tallying the night's receipts at a corner table. "Lock up when you're finished, Joe," she instructed the bartender. "I'll be in my office catching up on paperwork." The man nodded, accustomed to his employer's late hours, and continued his work as Eleanor led Morgan through the curtained doorway to her office. Once inside, with the door secured, she sagged slightly, the composed facade giving way to exhaustion. "Peterson is terrified," she reported, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass and offering it to Morgan before serving herself. "But he talked. Tom was right. Peterson has been keeping the syndicate's books, tracking the real ownership of properties purchased through shell companies. He claims he didn't know about the violence until the sheriff was killed. Says he thought it was just business, buying land before the railroad announcement drove up prices." Morgan accepted the whiskey, taking a contemplative sip. "Did he keep records?" Eleanor nodded, a flash of triumph in her eyes. "Better than that. He made copies of everything. Insurance, he called it. He's been afraid Green would eliminate him once the scheme was complete. The documents are in a safe deposit box at the bank, to which he's given me the key." She withdrew a small brass key from her pocket, turning it in the lamplight. It contains ledgers showing payments to hired guns, including the men who likely ambushed Tom, along with the true ownership records tracing back to the Denver Syndicate, enough to convince the territorial judge, Peterson believes. Morgan considered this development. Green will know something's wrong the moment Peterson doesn't appear at the bank tomorrow. "We'll need to move quickly," Eleanor agreed, outlining the next phase of their plan. "Peterson is leaving town tonight, taking the late stage to Cheyenne. By the time Green realizes he's gone, we'll have secured the evidence." The following morning brought unexpected complications. Morgan arrived at the bank just as it opened, only to find Randall Green already there, engaged in heated conversation with the head teller. "What do you mean Peterson's gone?" Green demanded, his usual smooth demeanor cracking under stress. "He can't just abandon the bank without notice." The teller, a young man, clearly intimidated by Green's anger, stammered that he'd found a note from Peterson, explaining a family emergency had called him east. Green's cold eyes swept the bank lobby, narrowing when they landed on Morgan, standing near the entrance. With visible effort, Green composed himself, straightening his waistcoat and adopting a business-like tone. "Well, this is most irregular. As a major investor in this institution, I'll have to take temporary control until the board can appoint a new manager. No customers beyond regular deposits and withdrawals until further notice." Morgan retreated, aware that their plan had just become significantly more complicated. If Green took control of the bank, accessing Peterson's safe deposit box would be impossible through normal channels. He made his way to the Lucky Strike, finding Eleanor in the storeroom, inventorying bottles. When he relayed the morning's development, her expression darkened. "Green's moving faster than we anticipated. He must suspect Peterson has fled because of a guilty conscience." She placed the inventory ledger on a nearby crate, thinking quickly. "There's another way into the bank, through the tunnels." At Morgan's questioning look, she explained. During the early mining days, several businesses in town connected their cellars with tunnels, partly for security and moving valuables, partly as escape routes during Indian raids. Most have been sealed up or forgotten, but the passage between this building and the bank still exists. Tom and I used it occasionally to make night deposits when the Lucky Strike had particularly good evenings. Eleanor led Morgan down narrow stairs into the saloon's cellar, where barrels of whiskey and beer were stored alongside crates of supplies. At the far end, behind several stacked crates, she revealed a low wooden door secured with a heavy padlock. "Tom kept the only key," she explained, producing a small ring from her pocket. "Part of his official duties, supposedly, though I think he just liked knowing the town's secrets." The lock opened with a reluctant click, and Eleanor lit a lantern before leading the way into a rough-hewn tunnel, shored up with timber supports that creaked ominously overhead. "The original miners dug these," she explained, as they moved forward in the dim light, following veins of silver that ran under the town itself. When the mines played out, the tunnels remained. After about 50 yards of careful progress, they reached another door, this one leading upward via a steep set of stone steps. "The bank's cellar," Eleanor whispered, "used for storing old records and supplies. The safe deposit boxes are on the main floor, in the manager's office." They emerged into a musty cellar, navigating around shelves of ledgers and paper supplies until they found the stairs leading up to the bank proper. Eleanor pressed a finger to her lips as they ascended, the sounds of business being conducted becoming audible as they approached the top. The door opened into a small storage room adjacent to Peterson's office, currently empty thanks to its occupants' hasty departure. Timing their movements to coincide with the noisier transactions in the lobby, they slipped into the office and located the cabinet containing the safe deposit boxes. Peterson's key fit perfectly into box number 7, which contained a leather-bound ledger and a sealed envelope. Eleanor quickly secured both inside her shawl, while Morgan kept watch at the door. Their retreat was equally successful, with no one the wiser as they descended back into the tunnel and made their way to the Lucky Strike cellar. Back in Eleanor's office, they examined their prize. The ledger contained meticulous records of property transactions spanning 3 years, with annotations indicating the true buyers, hidden behind various shell companies. The pattern was clear: a systematic acquisition of key properties throughout Redemption Creek and surrounding lands, all ultimately controlled by the Denver Syndicate, with Green as their local agent. The sealed envelope contained something even more damning: correspondence between Green and syndicate leaders discussing methods of persuasion for reluctant sellers, including references to making examples of those who refuse to cooperate. Most significantly, there was a receipt for payment to 2 known hired guns, dated the day before Sheriff McAllister's murder, with a notation simply reading, "Problem solved." Eleanor's hands trembled as she read this final piece of evidence. "This is it," she whispered. "Proof that they ordered Tom's death." Morgan studied the documents with grim satisfaction. "The territorial judge will have no choice but to act on this. Green, his brother, and the entire syndicate will face federal charges." Eleanor nodded, carefully replacing the papers in the envelope. "We need to keep these safe until Judge Hawkins arrives on Tuesday. Green will be searching frantically for Peterson by now, and when he can't find him, he'll start looking for whatever evidence Peterson might have left behind." They agreed that Morgan would secure the documents in a hiding place outside of town, while Eleanor would maintain her normal routine to avoid arousing further suspicion. "Be careful," Morgan warned as he prepared to leave with the envelope concealed inside his coat. "Green is dangerous, especially now that he's desperate. He knows something's wrong." Eleanor's answering smile was cold with determination. "Let him wonder. I've waited 3 weeks to see justice for Tom. I can manage 3 more days." The weekend passed with mounting tension in Redemption Creek. Green's men conducted increasingly obvious searches of the bank, Peterson's home, and other locations around town, their desperation evident in their roughshod methods. Morgan kept a low profile, observing from a distance while making preparations for the judge's arrival. Eleanor continued running the lucky strike, her composed demeanor betraying nothing of the dangerous game she played. On Sunday evening, Morgan was returning from placing the documents in a secure location outside town when he noticed unusual activity at Green's Mercantile. Through the window, he could see Randall and Zachary engaged in heated discussion, surrounded by several hard-looking men who were checking weapons and packing saddlebags. It appeared the Green brothers were preparing either for flight or for a final, desperate move to protect their operation. Either possibility threatened the fragile plan Morgan and Eleanor had constructed. Morgan circled around to the rear of the saloon, finding Eleanor in her office reviewing the night's earnings. When he reported what he'd seen, her expression grew grave. "They're panicking," she concluded. "Peterson's disappearance, your presence in town, my visits to the bank and land office. They know we're closing in." She rose, moving to a small cabinet from which she withdrew a Remington Derringer. "Tom insisted I keep this nearby," she explained, checking that the small pistol was loaded before returning it to its hiding place in the folds of her skirt. "I've never had to use it, but I've always known how." Morgan nodded with approval. "Keep it close. I don't trust Green to wait for the law to arrive. He's more likely to try eliminating the threat, meaning us, and disappearing with whatever assets he can liquidate quickly." Eleanor's face hardened with resolve. "Then we'll need to be ready when he makes his move." They didn't have long to wait. Shortly after midnight, as the last patrons were leaving the Lucky Strike, the sound of approaching horses drew Morgan to the window. 6 riders were dismounting outside, led by Zachary Green, whose drunken swagger was visible even in the dim light of the street lamps. "Bar the door," Morgan instructed Eleanor quietly, "and get your people out the back." As Eleanor hurried to secure the front entrance and evacuate the few remaining staff, Morgan positioned himself in the shadows. Zachary led the way, a bottle in one hand and a revolver in the other, flanked by 5 hired guns whose alert eyes belied their employer's drunken bravado. Come out, widow woman," Zachary called, his voice echoing in the now empty saloon. "Time we had us a reckoning." Morgan remained motionless in the shadows, counting weapons and assessing threats as the men spread out among the tables. Eleanor stepped through the curtain from her office, standing tall and unafraid as she faced the intruders. "This is private property, Mr. Green," she stated firmly. "You and your men need to leave, now." Zachary laughed, an ugly sound that held no humor. "Private property? That's rich, coming from you. This whole town belongs to my brother, or it will once we've dealt with interfering widows and whatever lawman you've brought in to help your lost cause." Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. "The only lost cause here is yours, Zachary. The territorial judge arrives tomorrow, and when he does, he'll see evidence of every crime you and your brother have committed, including the murder of my husband." Zachary's face contorted with rage. He raised his revolver, pointing it directly at Eleanor's heart. "There won't be any witnesses left by tomorrow, Mrs. McAllister, and no evidence either. My brother wanted to handle this quietly, but I've always preferred a more direct approach." It was the moment Morgan had been waiting for. With the attention of all 6 men focused on Eleanor, he stepped from the shadows, his peacemaker already leveled. "I wouldn't advise that," he said calmly. Zachary whirled, startled, but his hired guns reacted more professionally, drawing and turning toward the new threat with practiced speed. For a heartbeat, the tableau held. Eleanor standing proudly behind the bar, Zachary frozen mid-turn, his men tensed for violence, and Morgan with his weapon trained steadily on Zachary's chest. The stillness shattered as Zachary, impulsive and enraged, swung his revolver toward Morgan and fired. The shot went wide, splintering the door frame as Morgan dove behind an overturned table, returning fire with greater accuracy. One of the hired guns dropped with a cry, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted as the remaining men sought cover, bullets tearing through the saloon's furnishings. Eleanor ducked behind the solid oak bar, emerging moments later with a shotgun that had been kept there since the saloon's earliest days. The thunderous blast caught another of Green's men as he tried to flank Morgan's position, sending him sprawling. "The back door," Eleanor shouted over the gunfire, indicating the exit through her office. Morgan nodded, providing covering fire as she made her way along the bar toward the curtained doorway. One of the hired guns noticed her movement and shifted his aim, but Morgan's shot caught him in the leg before he could fire, dropping him with a howl of pain. Gradually, Morgan and Eleanor retreated toward the office, maintaining enough fire to keep their attackers pinned down among the wreckage of tables and chairs. Once through the curtain, Morgan overturned Eleanor's heavy desk, creating a barricade as bullets tore through the fabric divider. "The tunnel," Eleanor gasped, reloading the shotgun with practiced efficiency despite the circumstances. "We can reach the street behind the bank." They backed toward the cellar door, taking turns firing to hold back their pursuers. As they reached the stairs, Zachary Green appeared in the curtained doorway, his face a mask of drunken fury as he fired wildly into the room. A bullet grazed Morgan's arm, tearing his sleeve and drawing a line of fire across his bicep. He returned fire methodically, his third shot catching Zachary high in the chest, spinning the younger Green backward into his remaining men. In the confusion that followed, Morgan and Eleanor descended into the cellar and through the tunnel, emerging into the cool night air behind the bank. The sounds of gunfire had roused the town. Lights were appearing in windows, and shouts could be heard as braver citizens ventured into the street to investigate. "We need to find Hargrove," Morgan decided, pressing a handkerchief to his bleeding arm. "Green's men will regroup quickly." They made their way toward the sheriff's office, where lamps were already lit and voices could be heard inside. To their surprise, they found not only Deputy Hargrove, but also Randall Green himself, the latter maintaining a facade of civic concern as he urged the lawman to investigate the disturbance at the Lucky Strike. When Morgan and Eleanor entered, weapons still in hand, the tableau froze. Hargrove half risen from his desk, Green turning with well-feigned surprise that quickly transformed into calculated assessment. "Mrs. McAllister?" Green acknowledged smoothly, his composure remarkable given the circumstances. "We were just discussing the unfortunate commotion at your establishment. My brother can be impetuous, I'm afraid. I do hope there's been no serious trouble." His eyes flickered to Morgan's bloodied sleeve, then to the determined expression on Eleanor's face, measuring and recalculating with the precision that had made him the syndicate's chosen representative. Morgan kept his peacemaker leveled at Green's chest as Eleanor addressed Hargrove. "Deputy, I'm formally reporting an armed assault on my property and an attempt on my life by Zachary Green and his men. Mr. Blackwood and I were forced to defend ourselves. There are wounded men at my saloon, and possibly worse." Hargrove looked uncertainly between Eleanor and Randall Green, the conflict of loyalties evident in his troubled expression. "That's a serious accusation, Miss McAllister. Mr. Green here says he sent Zachary to discuss a business proposal with you, nothing more." "A business proposal delivered by 6 armed men after midnight?" Morgan asked, with dangerous quietness. Interesting negotiating tactic. He turned his attention fully to Green, who maintained his composure despite the weapon trained on him. "Your operation is finished, Green. We have the ledgers, the correspondence, the payment records, everything Peterson kept as insurance against the day you decided he'd outlived his usefulness. The territorial judge will have more than enough evidence to send you and your Denver associates to prison for a very long time." For the first time, Green's confidence wavered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before he regained control. "Preposterous accusations," he declared, though with less conviction than before. "Deputy Hargrove, I insist you arrest these individuals for slandering my good name and threatening me with a weapon in your very office." Hargrove hesitated, caught between the power Green had wielded in town and the evidence of violence that had just erupted. His hand hovered near his own sidearm, indecision plain on his face. "I suggest you consider your next move very carefully, Deputy," Morgan advised quietly. "The judge arrives tomorrow. Which side of this do you want to be on when he does?" It was Eleanor who tipped the balance, placing Peterson's bank key on Hargrove's desk with deliberate precision. "This opens safe deposit box 7 at the bank, Bill. Inside is proof that the Green brothers arranged my husband's murder. Tom was your friend. He trusted you to uphold the law he died defending." Hargrove stared at the key for a long moment before reaching a decision. With a fluid movement that surprised them all, he drew his revolver, not on Morgan and Eleanor, but on Randall Green. "Mr. Green, I'm placing you under arrest, pending the arrival of Judge Hawkins. You'll be held on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder and various land fraud violations." Green's mask of civility finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You're making a serious mistake, Hargrove. My associates in Denver won't take kindly to this interference in legitimate business operations. There won't be a place in the territory where you can hide if you pursue this foolishness." Hargrove's resolve seemed to strengthen rather than weaken in the face of the threat. "I've been making mistakes for too long, Mr. Green. It's time I honored the badge Tom trusted me with." As he secured Green with handcuffs, a commotion outside announced the arrival of townspeople, bearing news from the Lucky Strike. 2 of Green's men had been killed in the shootout, including Zachary, whose impulsive charge into Eleanor's office had proven fatal. The others were wounded or had fled, leaving behind ample evidence of their attempted assault. The night gave way to dawn as statements were taken, wounded men secured in the jail's limited cells, and telegrams sent to the territorial marshal's office requesting additional lawmen to help maintain order until the judge's arrival. Morgan and Eleanor worked tirelessly, retrieving the hidden documents and presenting them to Hargrove, who reviewed them with growing anger at the extent of the syndicate's operations. By mid-morning, a tentative calm had settled over Redemption Creek, though clusters of citizens gathered on street corners, discussing the night's events and the revelations that followed. The uneasy quiet was broken by the arrival of riders from the east. The territorial judge, Moses Hawkins, had decided to travel ahead of schedule and now approached with an escort of 4 deputy marshals. The Circuit of Justice, it seemed, was closing around Redemption Creek a day earlier than expected. Judge Hawkins was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered despite his 60 years, with a shock of white hair and piercing eyes that had evaluated truthfulness in courtrooms across the territory for over a decade. He listened to the evidence presented by Morgan, Eleanor, and Deputy Hargrove with judicial impassivity, asking occasional sharp questions that cut to the heart of the matter. When he finally spoke, his deep voice carried the weight of considered judgment. "I've seen similar operations in other growing towns along the proposed railroad routes," he acknowledged. "But rarely have I encountered evidence this comprehensive or a conspiracy this brazen." He turned to Morgan with newfound respect. "You've done the territory a service, Mr. Blackwood. The Federal Marshal's Office speaks highly of your efforts tracking these land schemes." To Eleanor, he offered a more personal acknowledgement. "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. McAllister. The law has failed you once. It will not do so again." The following days saw justice administered with methodical thoroughness. Randall Green and his surviving men were transferred to Cheyenne for formal arraignment on federal charges. Telegrams arrived confirming that authorities in Denver had moved against the syndicate's leadership based on the evidence from Redemption Creek. Property records were examined and corrected under the judge's supervision, restoring rightful ownership where fraud had been documented. Deputy Hargrove, having proven himself when it mattered most, was appointed acting sheriff with the judge's endorsement until proper elections could be held. Throughout it all, Eleanor McAllister maintained the quiet dignity that had carried her through weeks of grief and danger, accepting the town's belated support with grace while never forgetting those who had stood with her when it mattered, particularly the mysterious drifter whose timely arrival had helped bring her husband's killers to justice. On the morning Judge Hawkins prepared to continue his circuit, Morgan Blackwood packed his few belongings in the hotel room that had been his temporary home. His work in Redemption Creek was finished. There were other towns, other schemes to investigate as he continued his personal mission. As he settled his account with Willard Simmons, the proprietor asked the question many in town had been wondering. "Will you be staying on, Mr. Blackwood? Town could use a man with your experience." Morgan shook his head with a small smile. "I'm not one for settling down," he replied, though without the conviction such statements had held in the past. Outside the hotel, he found Eleanor waiting beside his saddled horse, her practical riding dress suggesting she'd come directly from her morning inspection of the Lucky Strike's repairs. "I thought I might miss you," she said, her composed features revealing little of her thoughts. You're leaving, then? Morgan nodded, securing his saddlebags. Other towns, other syndicates. The work isn't finished. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. There will always be other towns, Mr. Blackwood. The question is whether you're running toward something or away from it. The perceptiveness of her observation struck uncomfortably close to truths Morgan had avoided examining. Justice for my brother's family, he answered after a moment. That's what I've been running toward. Eleanor nodded, accepting his answer, while her eyes suggested she saw beyond it. And after? When you found all those responsible? What then? It was a question Morgan had carefully avoided asking himself during 3 years of relentless pursuit. Before he could formulate a response, Eleanor continued. Redemption Creek will need rebuilding after Green's influence is removed. The railroad is still coming. The future Tom and I planned for this town can still happen, but it will take people with both vision and the strength to defend it. She held his gaze steadily. People like us, perhaps. Morgan looked out over the town, seeing it suddenly not as a temporary stop on his journey, but as a place of potential, a community at a crossroads, its future direction yet to be determined. I'm not sure I remember how to stop moving, he admitted quietly. Eleanor's smile held understanding, earned through her own struggles. Then perhaps you don't stop all at once, she suggested. Perhaps you just ride a little less far each time, until one day you find you've come home without realizing it. She placed a hand briefly on his arm, the touch conveying more than words could express. The lucky strike will be here when you return from your next mission, Mr. Blackwood, as will I. With that, she turned and walked back toward her saloon, her straight back and determined stride speaking of a woman who had faced the worst the frontier could offer, and emerged stronger for it. Morgan mounted his horse, feeling the familiar sense of purpose that had driven him these past years. But as he rode slowly down Redemption Creek's main street, nodding acknowledgement to the townspeople who called their farewells, he found himself noticing details he might once have overlooked. The new construction already beginning where damaged buildings were being repaired, the children playing in the schoolyard, the sense of renewed hope that had replaced the tension of recent weeks. At the edge of town, he paused, looking back at the settlements spread before him. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of something beyond vengeance or justice, the possibility of building rather than simply avenging what had been destroyed. With a thoughtful nod to himself, Morgan turned his horse westward. There were still wrongs to right, still those who needed to answer for their crimes. But perhaps Eleanor was right. Perhaps the distance he traveled would grow shorter with each journey, until one day the road led back to Redemption Creek, to a town being reborn, and to a strong woman who understood both justice and second chances. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.